Welcome to the Lower Hudson Valley Special Education Task Force Program, Do's and Don'ts for Participating in Virtual CSE Meetings. My name is Julie Passman, and I'm here with my co-chair, Jess Bauman, and we have with us some other task force executive committee members, including Alyssa Galea, who's managing the Zoom, and Stefanie Shabman, who's one of our panelists, and Stephanie Bellantoni is here as well. Before we get started, I want to mention that attendees can turn on closed captioning by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can then select Show Subtitle, which will show the closed caption as subtitles on the screen, or you can click on Full View Transcript, which will show a chat box with all of the closed captioning. And I also need to share with you a notice of recording. This training will be recorded to ensure the information will be available to all who are interested. If you do not wish to have your image appear on the recording, please turn off your video. If you do not wish for your name to appear on the recording, please change your name by clicking the three dots, which are generally at the bottom of your screen, selecting Participants, hover over your name, select the word More, then select Rename, and you can rename it to anything other than your name. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Lower Hudson Special Education Task Force, we are the regional arm of the New York State Special Education Task Force, which is run under the auspices of Disabilities Rights New York. The Lower Hudson Special Education Task Force, it seeks to bring together constituents and stakeholders in special education across the full spectrum. And we all work together and come together in these forums, like the one tonight, to promote positive outcomes for students with disabilities. Most of you, or some of you, may have already participated in virtual CSE or 504 meetings, and many of you are likely heading into annual review season. So it's our hope that tonight's program will offer tips and do's and don'ts that will improve your meeting participation, avoid technology glitches, increase dialogue at the CSE table or 504 table, and promote consensus building. Some of the information you will hear tonight will likely transform the virtual platform and will also be useful when we return to face-to-face or what may be mask-to-mask settings. So we are really fortunate tonight to have with us three really incredible panelists. These highly knowledgeable and experienced panelists are Celia Strino. If you want to wave your hand, Celia. And we have Stefanie Shabman. Give a little wave, Stefanie. And Stefanie Vlope. Celia Strino is currently the Director of Secondary Special Education in White Plains City School District. She has over 20 years of experience in the education and legal industries, serving the needs of students and their families from pre-kindergarten through graduate studies in both the public and private sectors. Suzanne Vlope is a member of the law firm of Keane and Beane in White Plains. She represents public school districts as general counsel in Westchester, Nassau, Suffolk, and Rockland counties. And Stefanie Shabman is the legal director of Student Advocacy, Inc. Stefanie is deeply committed to Student Advocacy's mission of providing legally based education advocacy services to students in Westchester and Putnam counties. In addition to her work at Student Advocacy, Stefanie serves on the Appellate Division, Second Department, Attorney for the Child Panel, representing children in family court proceedings, including Article 10, juvenile delinquency proceedings, PINs, SIJ, and SIJ cases. So we have structured our program this evening so that our panelists will respond to a wide range of questions that we have developed in advance, and they all cover the issues related to virtual CSE meetings. We will try to reserve time at the end for participant questions, and the panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. So you may type questions into the chat box at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A, and the panelists will answer them as time permits. But please note that panelists will not be able to answer lengthy fact patterns that involve individual situations or lengthy fact patterns, and we ask that you structure your questions so they can really benefit the whole group. So with that, let's get started. So I thought we would start by asking each of the panelists if they could share some information about your own role around the CSE table in the virtual setting. So Suzanne, do you want to get started?
Sure. Thanks, Julie, and thanks, everybody. Very happy to be here tonight. As counsel for school districts, I'm typically invited to a CSE meeting when the parents and student are represented or have retained an advocate. My role at a CSE is really twofold. I'm there to represent the CSE and the district's interests. But in this context, what that means is making sure that the CSE develops a legally sound IEP, which provides the student, FAPE in the LRE. And forgive me if I'm using these. I'm hoping everyone is following me with my abbreviations.
Maybe we should just, before we get started, just make sure that we just say FAPE is a free appropriate public education and LRE is the least restrictive environment.
Thank you. At the juncture where I'm at a CSE meeting, be it remote, be it in person, the parties, I don't believe the parties are adversarial, despite the presence of attorneys. My role is to make sure that the process is followed and that the CSE does what it is legally obligated to do. At times, that may mean challenging the parents or their attorneys if they request things that are beyond the scope of the CSE, beyond the scope of the district's obligation. But it's not the time where school attorneys put their advocate hat on. We're really there to counsel as needed. And again, that really applies virtual, remote, however we're calling it, and also in person.
Stefanie?
So good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here again to speak with you all about this topic and to be on this panel with these wonderful colleagues. Student advocacy's role remains pretty much the same, whether it be virtual or in person. And we are deeply committed to working collaboratively and using a problem-solving approach that's based on the law and what the student is legally entitled to. And with that approach, we're always studying the law. And as we know, with COVID, things are changing daily. So we're really happy to be there to help the parent understand what they're entitled to and sometimes what they're not entitled to. So in doing that, we feel that the meetings will be equitable for everybody. And we are very cognizant of the fact that this is just one meeting which we may attend, but that the child has to be in the district or probably will be in the district unless they move for a very long time. So we try to model real collaborative problem solving because we really think it's to the benefit of the child.
Thank you. Celia, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, Julie, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with everyone tonight. So my role usually at the CSE table will be one of two, either as the chairperson or as an administrator supporting the chairperson in the committee. And as part of that, really the role is to ensure that all parts of the IEP are addressed, that all the stakeholders and everyone at the table has a voice in the process, and that all of the components of the meeting are met and adhered to, and that to the extent possible, that everyone leaves the table with consensus around the IEP and the services and what the child will be getting in the way of programs and accommodations. I've also sat on the CSE as a parent as well. I know that that's the complete flip side, but I've been doing virtual meetings both in the capacity from the district as well as from the parent side.
Thank you. So I'm also wondering if the three of you have noticed any changes in the pre-CSE meeting process. If you're having pre-CSE meetings, has this changed during COVID-19 and virtual meetings or remote meetings? Suzanne, do you want to start?
Sure. I would say I'm noticing a little bit more strenuous is the wrong word, but more rigorous preparation in terms of making sure everybody has the meeting packet per se, everybody has your login. I'm getting, it's very nice and I hope it continues. I'm getting Outlook calendar updates from my clients saying this is the meeting, and I love it. It just pops onto my calendar. So I'm noticing things like that where there's an emphasis on the preparation. These are the documents we're going to be looking at. They're being emailed to you in advance of the meeting, things like that. I've noticed specifically, and I would imagine it's going to continue. Not that we weren't preparing before. I'm noticing that it's a little bit more formal.
Okay, that's a pro. Stefanie?
So sure, I'd like to jump in on that. And when I think about the pre-CSE meeting, we think about the meetings that we have with our clients, and student advocacy does not represent children or families at meetings where we don't meet our clients. And we're very committed to that. So we kind of had a pivot and have meetings in a different way. We've begun to do them on Zoom, and it's still not the same to me as meeting in person, but we really emphasize very rigorously, as Suzanne said, that the clients be prepared for the meetings. Because when you're on Zoom, especially people who have been on a lot of Zoom meetings, and we want them to understand that this is the meeting, not the dress rehearsal. And we want them to prepare and have the same kind of feeling as though they were sitting at central office or in a school building. So we try to coach on that so that they are prepared and ready to proceed. We also really try to make sure that they understand the evaluations, because a lot of the personal body language, the ability to step out of a meeting and explain something isn't there any longer when you're on Zoom. So in our preparation, we're trying to give them tips about things like that as well.
Yeah, sounds like a lot more planning is necessary. Celia, do you want to share your thoughts?
So I think the pre-CSE meeting practices are going to vary from district to district and are always rooted in what districts were doing prior to virtual meetings. So whatever the starting point was for a district, they would adapt those practices to this new online format. I can speak to what a couple districts do because it really does depend and vary. But one thing I will say is there has been sort of an increased role for service coordinators and teachers and evaluators to really reach out ahead of time in meetings and to increase parent communications before there even is a meeting on the calendar, to really make sure that those communications are ongoing throughout the year. In terms of paperwork and trying to get all the documents together, it really depends on the accessibility needs for the family, whether those things are emailed or mailed or hand delivered to a house or available for pickup at a school. So it's really having to think more about what the needs of the individual family and participants are with regard to obtaining materials prior to a meeting, and just being a little bit more flexible in those practices. A couple other things, in terms of pre-CSE stuff, I think there's also been a move to consolidate a lot of pieces of information, whereas you used to receive like a very large packet of paper, to the extent that all of that can now be consolidated to say into a draft IEP where you have people collaboratively developing a draft together. There's also been an increase in that as well.
Do you mean staff collaborating to develop?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And so where there might be complications with getting large amounts of either electronic documents or paper documents to a family, the preference might be that everyone puts their teacher report directly into a draft and then one document is shared, because you have to be mindful about if you're sending large amounts of paperwork to a family that they might need to print that out, right? And so it's also about really trying to communicate with families to understand what their needs are and what their accessibility to things like printers or ability to pick things up might be.
Yeah.
Can I just add something? We really appreciate from a parent's perspective that approach, because sometimes it's very difficult to get the documents, and some of them are so lengthy and they really do require preparation and explanation, and parents can't print it out. That's exactly right. We had to get DocuSign at my office because parents couldn't print out a simple release and sign it, or a retainer. So could you imagine all the documents? So from the parents or the family's perspective, that's extraordinary that the districts are really trying. And it does also need you to plan a little bit more in advance, as opposed to getting a last minute eval the night before a meeting, because the parent can't see it or read it at that time. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, all of you. I think that our participants might be interested in hearing some of your suggestions about the type of meeting preparation you recommend for parents, for school staff, for advocates, or others, whoever you are advising, and to the extent that these recommendations are relevant to virtual and in-person preparation. Suzanne, you want to start?
Sure. I would say the same kind of preparation, right? Review your documents, pull, and if I'm advising school districts, right? Bring your student data, bring your work samples, bring anything that you plan on presenting or referring to in a meeting. For virtual meetings, being not the best tech person, I would advise, and I'm sure this is across the board, that you double and triple check that you've got the technology in place, and that from the school district side, if we're running the Zoom or the Google Meet or the Microsoft Teams, that all the participants have that information and have the call-in number and the backup to the backup to make sure that at least everyone has the information, and then go from there. At least begin the meeting try to begin the meeting relatively on time with everybody accessing the technology. So yes, for the district, definitely everything we kind of said before, being more organized, reviewing your documents, having your agenda items, having your notes ready, your student work samples, bring your data, things like that.
Stefanie?
So on the flip side of that, we're trying to make sure that the parents and that we have the correct logins, the correct information, the correct access to the meetings. And it's very similar to when we would go to an in-person meeting, because we would want to make sure they have the right school building or the right room number, because we wanted everybody to show up on time and ready to proceed. It's just a different venue, but it's the same kind of concept. And we do query the parents about their ability to access the technology and make sure that they are comfortable with it. And in the event for some reason they can't or they don't have a device, we try to work very collaboratively. The school districts have worked collaboratively with us to provide either a device to borrow, a room in a school building if there's a hotspot or a Wi-Fi issue and things like that. And we've been working it out, but you do have to do the planning. You can't just show up. You have to have it all organized.
Thank you. Celia?
So I think, it's interesting, because if anything's going to go wrong in a virtual platform, it's going to be the one thing you didn't plan for, right? And so it's always you always want to make sure that you have your device ready, that, you have a phone number to call into. But it's sort of like the unexpected glitch that you're not planning for. That's going to be what happens. For example, the dog barking right now, that kind of stuff. So I think what's important is that you make sure that you have accessibility to devices, but also that you have the ability to communicate with the district and the CSE in case a meeting needs to be rescheduled, right? Because of these glitches. At a certain point, it's, you have to be prepared to say, well, maybe we're going to come back and try this again another day. So having a couple dates in mind that you could reschedule would be very helpful, so that that kind of thing can be organized right in the moment. If there are too many technical glitches, if a teacher can't get on because, they're for whatever reason. So I think that's the one sort of new thing that I've really learned, is that if families and caregivers come with, saying, all right, we're going to, make our best effort to hold this, but if there's some problem or it takes 20 minutes to get this meeting started, here are a couple times that will work for us when we can continue this conversation. And that will sort of reduce the back and forth after the fact and trying to reschedule.
Yeah, it sounds like some flexibility and contingency plans can go a long way in the virtual world. This may sort of piggyback on what we've already been discussing, but are there any particular materials or resources or documents that you suggest the parents you're advising, the school districts you're counseling, that they should review before a virtual CSE meeting? And this may be similar to the same types of documents they're reviewing for in-person meetings.
Yeah, I would say this, at a minimum, if it's accessible to staff, because there are privacy concerns in place. But if last year's IEP is accessible to staff, I would say have a look. Any current reports, reevaluation reports, any reports that are going to be reviewed, same as in your non-virtual, your in-person setting. And for any staff, any district staff, to be familiar with the report you're going to present. Also reread it, read it again. Get yourself, you may have written it 2 weeks ago, you may have, and I think the same can apply really to anyone who's participating in a meeting based upon a document or based upon something they prepared, so, a few weeks ago. Get familiar with it again. I do it myself. I go over and over my notes right before the meeting, just in case I maybe forgot something. But that really, to me, is more universal. I don't know. Obviously, Stefanie, Celia.
So we encourage the parents to keep a list of questions or a list of information. And it's the same thing. We want them to review what their goal of the meeting is, to understand what information they want to impart and that they want to share with the committee. And we ask that they listen and be really active. I think it's really important for the parents not only to participate and express their concerns and their interests and their desires, but it's also very important for them to listen to all the providers who have been pulled together and be active listeners, because I kind of tell them, like, leave a little space that you can write the answer to the question that you had, because it very well might be that the speech and language person answers your question, and I think it's really helpful, and it keeps parents focused. And like, I always am writing the notes, so I think if they're writing the notes as well, and I would recommend the same thing, but I think even more so that the focus for a virtual meeting can sometimes, it's a little more difficult because there are a lot of other external distractions sometimes. So I would recommend that for parents. I think it would really help them.
And are there certain documents, Stefanie, that you have parents review, like the IEPs and the reports? Do you go over that?
Absolutely.
Have them?
If it's an initial, then we certainly go over every new report and explain to them what's going to happen and what the meeting's going to look like, and prep them for, what they can expect at a meeting, and what, and explain to them what they can expect at the meeting and what shouldn't be at the meeting, just as much as what should be at the meeting. That would be the same in any case. But in terms of the reports, if there's any new evaluations, of course, we're studying them. And as soon as we're studying them, we're explaining them to the parents. And very often the providers have already explained them to the parents, so that we go over it again, so that they really understand and can form the questions that they have about their child.
Thank you. Celia?
So in regard to materials and resources, I think there's one very real new factor in all of these meetings this year is families and caregivers have really had an opportunity to experience their child's learning experience and to observe their child learning within a remote environment. And so I think it's very useful for parents and caregivers to utilize tools or frame what they've seen and their observations and their questions around what they've seen prior to the meeting. There are a lot of great tools online that you might want to ask your school district, for some, examples of like how to do like a little report or something like that. If you wanted to submit it ahead of time, WIHD has some tools, but really trying to think about and prepare how you want to explain what your child's learning looked like in the remote environment, because I found that that's been a big part of discussions this year.
Thank you. So the next question is a question we never thought we were going to be asking over a year ago, but do you have any suggestions for how your clients or parents should set up the room where they're going to be participating in this Zoom meeting? Where should the computer or the device, or what's the best way for them to set themselves up, or what are some suggestions you can offer? You want to go maybe we'll go the opposite way. Celia, you want to start?
So I think it depends what people are comfortable with. So for example, you might want to use the Zoom background, something like that. I would say something that, it sort of reduces distraction, clutter. And if it's not possible, just find a space where you are comfortable and where you feel like you can think and really focus on what's happening at the meeting.
Suzanne?
I have it was funny when you said clutter, because I looked behind me to see all of our books and laughed a little bit, but I definitely agree with the distraction piece, because it's just so easy to look and get distracted, and to really echoing what Stefanie said earlier about how this is the real meeting, this isn't the dress rehearsal. So a room free of distraction, make your phone silent, close the door, do what you can to minimize interruptions and minimize distractions. I just think because it's so easy to look at the mailman or if you're at home or anything like that. So everything that Celia said, certainly in terms of distractions and being able to focus.
So my concern for parents is, and it goes to the point of the meeting, not the dress rehearsal, but it also is, there's some flexibility. They can take a meeting maybe from work where they couldn't before and they had to be physically present. And I always worry about the privacy issues. I mean, I'm worried that they're on the bus, or that their kid is hearing, or their other kid is hearing this meeting about this child. And I always really try to encourage that they are able to sit someplace not only free of distraction, but that's private, because this is private stuff we're talking about. And I don't want the whole world to hear it. I don't want the whole bus to hear it. And I know parents are doing the best we can, and we're all doing the best we can as professionals, trying to keep everything in place. But it's really, I think that's really important. This is serious business, and we want the clients and the children's privacy to be respected. And I think that there has been, and I know this from my work from student advocacy, but also from my court work, there has been some tremendous concerns about people sharing their personal space. And it can be uncomfortable for some people to share their personal space. So if they have the Zoom, but some people don't have the ability to even put the Zoom background on or whatever, or don't even think about it. So we do try to prep people when we talk to them, about make sure it's private, make sure it's quiet, and make sure, of course, you can pay attention.
And Stefanie, maybe you want to take this next question too. It's sort of a follow-up. What do you recommend in terms of turning on the camera?
Yeah, I need to see people. And I think that part of the CSE is the communication with the teachers and all the people at the table, and to really understand. And as I think that it's much better to see somebody, because there can be miscommunication in an email or in something like that. And to really see somebody really passionately talking about your child, or you talking about your child, can really have an impact on what people decide to do and what the process, the planning process for this child really will be. So I think it's very, very important, but we can't make them, you know. And I know in the beginning, when there were a lot of school people at home, that the chairs turned on their cameras, but not necessarily the teachers, because maybe the teachers felt uncomfortable. They were at home. And I know that some of the parents do not want to share. I've had to cancel meetings because parents weren't in a place that they couldn't. They felt very embarrassed. It was their bedroom and this and that. And I understood that. And I think everybody at the table understood those concerns.
Stefanie? I'm sorry, Suzanne?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you guys just heard the pots and pans tumble in my kitchen. I apologize. I think, yes, for me, I tend to agree with Stefanie. I would recommend that participants turn their camera on, but really echoing what Stefanie said, I understand that for any number of reasons, participants may not want their camera on. And that you can't, as you said, you really can't force anyone to do it. I don't want to say it's to their detriment, but it's their choice, and they're allowed. That's their choice that they're making. And again, there's so many reasons why that it's difficult to mandate it.
Of course. Celia?
I mean, I just echoing what everyone says. It's really understanding and respecting people's preferences. And I also want to throw out there that there's always the good old-fashioned conference call. So if you're very uncomfortable, or a family is very uncomfortable utilizing Zoom, having, videos on, it could be scheduled as a conference call over the phone as well. So if there is a level of uncomfort with cameras and those kinds of things, I would recommend reaching out to your district to find out what alternatives there are.
Yeah, we forget less sophisticated technology that exists with Zoom mania. Maybe Celia, you want to take this one. Can you offer some best practices or how you open CSE meetings, how you get started, whether they're introductions or checking in with parents? How do you get started, particularly in the virtual environment?
Again, best laid plans are always to make sure everyone is introduced. The chairperson really should be taking on the responsibility of sort of indicating who's going to introduce themselves next, because everyone is situated in Zoom differently. And so, it goes out of order. It can be very awkward. So starting with introductions and then proceeding with the meeting as it would ordinarily happen. I would say 9 times out of 10, the best laid plans don't go that way. And there's, oh, can you hear me? Is this person on? Who's that phone number? So really just understanding that might take a little while to get the meeting started is always important.
Stefanie, do you have anything to add? Stefanie.
Thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. So,
illustrating the problems
the
with
things
Zoom.
I'm very good at illustrating, right? So I kind of been thinking about this a little bit, and there's something that's been going around New York State Bar and the courts and everything all day. And there's a new practice that they're using even in the courtrooms, and they actually read what the decorum should be like. And today it came up again. I got another email from the second department and they actually read this: dress in appropriate attire if you're appearing, display an appropriate and professional background, no consumption of food or drink during the proceeding, remain professional and dignified. And as in in-person proceedings, only one person should speak at the same time. And I think that that applies to CSE meetings in person or on Zoom. And I think that it's a very, very critical meeting. And I think that all of those things will just add to the tone of the meeting. So I would certainly recommend that. And I have been on, especially in the beginning, with many parents, and it's coming a little later on in some of the questions, if the children participate, that they should be dressed like they're going to a meeting. Shouldn't be in their pajamas. They shouldn't be laying in their bed. That's how I would counsel a client to be ready for a meeting. I wouldn't attend like that, and I wouldn't expect them to, So, I mean, it's a little bit off the questions point, but I think the decorum is very important because I think it sets the stage.
Thank you. That's interesting. Suzanne?
I think just a couple things I want to mention. Clear introductions, clear ground rules, right? Everybody who's here. I had a meeting where we didn't know who all was in the room, and I think that came as a surprise later in the meeting. Mm-hmm. So inquiring as to who is there, who can hear, who can see, because again, as Stefanie, Celia, as we've all said, this is very private. And so it's not unfair for us all to know who's here and who's listening and who's watching. I also think it's always important that the district, whoever's running the meeting, set clear expectations for the meeting. This is a program review. This is a requested review. It sounds very simple. This is an annual review. This is a reeval. It sounds very simple, but I think it helps the parent. It only helps the parents. And by parents, I mean parents and guardians and people in parental relationship. I'll just use the word parent. But I think it's important that everybody know why we're meeting today, and with whom we're meeting and why we're having that meeting. And I think that's always important, an important way to start a CSE.
Thank you. Maybe Stefanie, you want to start with this one. And I'm interested to hear all your thoughts of how you utilize a meeting agenda, meaning how do you develop a meeting agenda? Is that your practice? Do you share, if you're representing a parent or a school district, do you share it with the school district and vice versa with the parent? Stefanie, you want to start with that?
There you go. Sorry. I don't typically draft an agenda because it's not my meeting, in that I'm not running or hosting the meeting. Like, I wouldn't pick the platform. But I typically have, and the advocates who work with me will laugh at me if they hear me say this. I like, if you're arguing an appellate brief, you have 4 major bullet points. Those are the 4 essential things that you have to bring out at that meeting. So, and those are the 4 points that I've discussed with the client, or based on the evaluations and recommendations and the teacher reports, that I think are critical to be discussed. And it's the same whether it's virtual or not. But it's not something I would share. But if we're collaborating and working with the school district, we certainly would say these are the things that the parents expressing they need, but it wouldn't be in the form of like a typical agenda.
Right, but just sharing your thoughts and your goals for the meeting ahead of time, you would do that?
If the attorney for the school district had the ability or the time, or we had the relationship to share, and if the parent wanted me to, because it's all in an effort to collaborate, not to pull any surprises out or anything like that, because it's not going to help anybody at the meeting.
Right. Suzanne?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in terms of a written agenda, not as much, but I think if parents have certain concerns, I think it's the best way for them to present those concerns to the CSE so that the CSE can respond in turn. Some of, again, depending on the case, depending on the child, some of my districts will ask me, can you reach out to the advocate? Stefanie, Shabman, and I have had many of those conversations in advance of the CSE. What are they thinking? What are you thinking? That kind of thing. And it's not just Stefanie, it's all of her colleagues and other parent side attorneys as well. But yes, I think whether or not the parents share a written agenda, I think just keeping their thoughts organized, it benefits the whole committee.
Right, Celia?
So I think it's going to vary from district to district what the practice is in terms of sharing a formalized agenda prior to a meeting. Oftentimes you'll see the draft IEP serving as an agenda. And I know, at least for me, when I'm chairing a meeting, I'll just run through briefly the sequence of what we're planning on doing. Again, in the virtual world, there definitely needs to be a little bit of flexibility in the agenda, because if you're planning on moving sequentially through an IEP and then all of a sudden the counselor who's supposed to speak next loses internet access, or there's a drill in the school or whatever it is, because people are also situated in different places now, that there's just sort of inherent flexibility in the agenda. And in terms of soliciting the input from a parent advocate or a parent up front, really asking right at the start of the meeting, so what are some of the thoughts that you have coming to this meeting today, and just putting those out right up front and incorporating them into the agenda in the moment can be very useful.
Yeah. And this we've touched on this a bit, but in the virtual environment or the remote environment, how are you ensuring that all the participants are really on the same page in terms of looking at the same documents and following along? There can be greater challenges when you're not all sitting around the CSE or 504 table. How have you managed that? Do you want to start, Celia?
Sure. Again, it will vary from district to district and practice to practice. I can say that in meetings that I chair, I will share the screen with the document. And then obviously if there's translation needed, making sure that, that people know how to adjust the screen so that the speaker or the translator is prominent, like in the Zoom boxes as well. But in terms of sharing documents, I think I usually try to put the draft IEP up or the evaluation up that is being discussed on the screen. And then as the chairperson, really actively helping the committee to navigate that. So as someone's talking through, making sure that I'm scrolling through and, highlighting things in real time if necessary.
And do you find that you need to check in with parents to make sure that they can see the document and they're following along?
Parents will tell you if they can't see the document, and usually I would check in as well. There's a lot of moving pieces to coordinate all of this. And so, especially if you're managing multiple documents throughout, it's helpful if people just will say, hey, can you make that a little bit larger? Someone did that today and it was very helpful. Because the other thing that sometimes I forget as a chairperson is someone might be looking at it on their cell phone. And meanwhile, I've got a big double screen. So it looks huge for me, but I'm not necessarily aware of the devices that other people are on. So yes, check in, ask. Can you see this? Can everyone see this? Do you have the paper copy? Make sure that they're the same documents. That's happened as well. A document gets emailed home that maybe is a different version or was sent home before the document that's being shared and has now been updated. And so just really checking in to make sure everyone's on the same page and the document that's being discussed is displayed.
So it sounds like it would be a good idea for parents to share with the school district if they're participating via a handheld device, an iPhone, an iPad, because the person who's chairing the meeting will need to adjust the screen and the size so they can see for their device.
Right, to zoom in or to help, really try and also that, yeah. So I think it's helpful if someone says, well, gee, I'm on a cell phone, can you make that larger?
Right. Stefanie?
I've never had the opportunity to be at a meeting with Cecilia, but I've never had anybody share the screen for a draft IEP in the virtual world. I've seen many draft IEPs and I've gotten them as part of packets. So I usually I'm very old school, because at home I use one screen, and in the office I have 3 screens. Sometimes it's crazy. So I just print it, and I'm just like, are you on page 3? You know, are you on page 9 or whatever? And that's how I keep track. And that's how I, kind of taught the parents to look at the evaluation and read along. But I've never seen the screen shared in the CSE meeting. So that's a great tip that I learned tonight. So thank you.
Suzanne?
Yes, so I have a few districts that do share the screen with the draft IEP. I've also seen one of my districts typing in live, typing things into the IEP, which I thought was great for so many reasons. And I thought that was a very good practice. But I think, echoing what everyone is saying is that, organization is key. Checking in is key. And I think that parents should not be afraid to speak up. Same thing with district staff. If you're not sure where we are or what we're looking at, speak up and say, hold on one second, what are we looking at? I was here, I think I lost my place. Just makes for a better meeting. It sounds counterintuitive, but it really does make for a better meeting when we know that everyone's following along and everyone is literally on the same page.
If I may just add one thing to that. So in terms of sharing screens and accessibility, I just think it's important to remember that chair people and committee members might be at different places with knowing how to use the technology. And so also just understanding that it might vary from meeting to meeting, even within the district, as chair people and teachers are learning how to share screens or use Adobe Pro, and that might have different comfort levels with utilizing the different accessibility options that are available.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if you have some suggestions for how you've encouraged effective turn taking at the CSE meeting table and ensuring that parents have a voice at the table. Do you want to start, Celia?
So I think it varies from chairperson to chairperson and district to district with whatever the training is or the protocols are for meetings. I think a really good way to approach this is to have the chairperson really indicate whose turn it is to talk, and then after each segment offer the parents, caregivers, advocate an opportunity to ask questions or provide feedback. It's less organic on Zoom, and so it definitely needs to be more structured. When you're sitting around the table, you can see people's body language more, the flow of the conversation is a lot smoother. And so just making sure that, okay, if we're going to be talking about this portion of the PLEPS, this practitioner is going to give their update, and then there's going to be explicit built-in time for the family to ask questions or the advocate to provide input.
Thank you. Stefanie?
So the one thing that I think is different from the other side of the table is that when you're sitting next to your client, you're able to assess how they're feeling, if they're getting upset, or if they're happy with something that a provider is saying. And we've taken many parents out of meetings who needed to have a moment, or things needed to calm down, or things needed to be explained again in a different way. And you lose that on the Zoom. So what we do is we have told parents that if you have, not a little question, but if you have something that's really important that you feel that you need to be said at this particular moment, or you're very concerned about it, that you just come offline and speak to us offline, just as though we would walk outside of a CSE meeting and talk to somebody. I think parents are less inclined, and most people would be less inclined to do that, because it's a little bit more it's another step. You kind of have to let that person know that you need to talk to them privately, as opposed to somebody just like kicking you under the table kind of thing, so, or passing you a little note. So it's a different feeling, but I think that's important because, as everybody keeps saying, is that they want everybody's voice to be heard, and it's their opinions are important. And sometimes parents are hesitant to share things, and maybe it would be pertinent or relevant, and they want to consult with you about it. And I think there's no reason to take 2 minutes to, but make sure that they tell them to shut off the camera and mute it so that they don't hear the conversation. So that's the other glitch. You have to make sure everybody can handle the technology.
And Stephanie, for unrepresented parent or guardian, what if that parent did become overwhelmed in the meeting and they didn't have an advocate or an attorney with them? What would you suggest for that parent if they got overwhelmed? To ask for a 2-minute break to pull themselves together? And
sometimes the person chairing the meeting will be able to assess that, but it's definitely difficult over Zoom. And they might say, we all need, or they might see that one of the school personnel is getting uncomfortable with the conversation. And we take breaks all the time in CSE meetings. And I think it's good to do that, especially if it's very long and there's a lot of information that's being disseminated. It's just different over Zoom. So I don't think there's anything wrong about asking politely to have 2 minutes to compose yourself or get a drink of water or something like that. I think that everybody would appreciate it.
Suzanne, do you have anything to add?
Nothing different to add. I think it's as Celia said, after, I've been in a few reevals virtual, which is tough, and asking and doing very formal breaks to ask for input, because you can't see eyes glazing over, you can't see the confusion in people's faces necessarily that you can see in a room. And so I think the formal breaks for, does anyone have anything to add? And I think it's a good practice, and I think it's a good practice, period. And we should definitely incorporate that going forward.
Thank you. So now I want to turn our attention to students who are attending CSE meetings virtually, and hear whether you have any suggestions regarding whether or not, under what circumstances students should participate, how they should participate, how parents can speak to them about their role at a CSE meeting that is held virtually. Stefanie, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So I love when my kids come to meetings. I think that is the most important thing. Now, in many, many districts, the people at the table know the child. They know the child intimately. They're the child's teacher or the child service provider. But in some very big districts, there are a lot of people at the table who have no idea who this child even is. They didn't evaluate this child. So I love when my kids come to meetings, because I feel it's for and about them. And I feel it's a way to empower them at whatever stage or age they're at. Not all kids want to, not all parents want their children at the meetings, and I understand that. But certainly by the time they're older and we're talking about transition goals and things like that, it's so much more meaningful to have the child at the meeting. I do tell my children that they ought to be very appropriate, and I have been at meetings where I didn't know that the child was listening. Somebody brought that up earlier on the panel. I didn't know the child was in the room, neither did anybody else on the Zoom, and all of a sudden the child, kind of chimed in, and the CSE chair was wonderful how she conducted it, but the kid started cursing, and we had to say, this is just like being in school. The meeting is just equivalent to being in school. You got to act like you act in school, but it is challenging, and especially if you don't know the kid's going to be there, and there is more of a likelihood that a kid will show up if it's in their house than it is if it's in in person and you don't know. So that did happen to me. And again, the appropriate decorum for a meeting. And I think it's good modeling for the children to hear all the grown-ups who care about them, who think that they can do certain things that maybe they don't think they can do. So I always encourage kids to go to meetings, but it does take prep work. And we don't usually have children stay at the entire meeting because there's a lot of stuff that they don't need to hear.
Right. Yeah, thank you for highlighting. I think, children often have home behavior and school behavior, and this really fuses the two, and they need to be explicitly instructed about how to participate in this type of meeting. Suzanne, do you have something to add?
Sure. Just to echo, Stefanie, I think when, after a certain age, I do think we need the students' buy-in so much, right? For their, because it's their IEP. So it is really valuable, what kinds of things work for you? Does a verbal check-in work for you? Does a nonverbal check-in work for you? And again, this is depending on the student and the student's capabilities, of course. But I was in a similar meeting where we were surprised that the student was there and had not, there wasn't anything that we would have done differently, of course, but it would have been nice to know. So, if the student's going to be present, I think the student could be in the frame the entire time, or perhaps be on their own tablet, maybe in the same house, but in their own box, in their own screen. Aside from that, I mean, really just everything Stefanie said in terms of their participation.
Celia?
So I think it's important to remember that our kids are infinitely better at using all of this stuff than we are, and they've been using Zoom and technology all year to learn. And so I think it's a great opportunity for kids to really become meaningful participants in the meeting, especially because I found that, that people tend to be a little bit more more comfortable in the Zoom environment, especially the kids, because there's almost that barrier there. You're not surrounded by a bunch of adults at a big table in a room with a closed door, right? So it's a fantastic opportunity for kids to learn how to be more meaningful participants in kind of a sheltered environment. And it's a really great opportunity to leverage. I would say, as a chairperson, I assume that if the parent is at home and the child is there learning remotely, that the child is listening. I just work on that basic assumption that whoever in the house, and it's not just the student, it's the student's siblings, it could be cousins, there are a lot of different factors that play in there. A couple extra points to consider to enhance student participation is to help your child prepare. And again, I can refer back to those WIHD tools, the student IEP generator. And some districts are included if we know ahead of time that a student will participate, having them sit down with the service coordinator, get some of that feedback ahead of time. And then also being mindful of the students' accommodations during the meeting, and to the extent possible, making sure that the meeting is accessible. So for example, making sure that there's limited distractions, if the student benefits from prompts, those kinds of things. So.
Thank you. Could you just clarify for those who aren't familiar with WIHD, well, we also have Stefanie Bellantoni on this program, but maybe you could just tell them what WIHD resource is and the IEP generator.
So maybe can we let Stefanie do that? So it's the Westchester Institute of Human Development, and it's it's actually an online tool that prompts a student through each section of the IEP in student-friendly language. So it gives them an opportunity to develop their own IEP, and then at the end they can print it out and come prepared to the meeting, having had the opportunity to really sort of think through the different parts and what they really need, and helping them to frame the language. So I don't know if I did that justice, but it's a great tool, and I'm sure there are other tools out there as well. That's just the one that I'm familiar with.
You got a thumbs up from Stefanie Bellantoni of WIHD, so you did great. So I want to turn next, and we've touched on some of these issues of technology, but if there's anything that you want to add to how you've been using technology for the CSE and 504 meetings, the strategies you found helpful, and maybe even touch on whether you advocate for recording Zoom meetings and any issues of consent and privacy, or whether or not you use the chat box. Suzanne, do you want to get started?
Sure. So in terms of recording, I think treating a recording of a Zoom meeting very similar to the audio recording of a CSE, making sure that if the parent wants to record, they let the CSE know, so that the CSE can also, if they would like, and our typical practice is to also record so that there's a recording. If the parent, that's what I would say. I would say that all parties need to be on the same page about the recording. And in terms of the chat box, I think it's okay for simple questions like what page are we on? Or I had a meeting once where it was the end of the school day and the gen ed teacher didn't want to interrupt the flow of the meeting and just kind of put in a chat to everybody, I've got a childcare issue, and then the chairperson was able to address it. I think that's okay, or some sort of a technical question like I can't hear you or I can't see you. Aside from that, it's not part of the record per se, and I wouldn't want to rely on it as part of a record. So aside from those kinds of technical questions, I think I would stay away from the chat box. I mean, the parents can use it maybe to jot notes or something, but it's not what I would call part of the record of the meeting. So I really wouldn't necessarily advise using it in that way. But that's just one. That's the lawyer's thoughts. I'm sure everyone's thoughts are a little bit different on that.
Yeah, that's why we have a panel. Stefanie?
So I would concur. I have not been at any Zoom CSE meeting that was recorded to date, and I would never participate in a meeting where something was being recorded where my client was recording it, unless it was proper or appropriate notice to everybody sitting at that table. I can't, but again, you can't control what somebody's doing when you're not in the room with them. Like I can kind of see if somebody's got their phone out under the table, but I can't see that on Zoom. But we don't record our clients don't record us. And we're really going to collaborate and solve questions and problems and make sure that, an appropriate IEP is being developed for this kid and the kid's getting what they need. And we don't want to go in there and start recording people. I know that there are certain times that it's needed. Sometimes it's needed for accessibility issues. People can't follow, they can't process. And to me, that's a totally different question and a totally different reason to record a meeting, but I would still put everybody on notice that I was recording or that my client was going to record the meeting. And that's how I know that there are many parents, lawyers who probably disagree with that. And that's always been the position that student advocacy takes, because it's our approach to the advocacy. In terms of a chat box, I agree. Like I'm thinking of it's kind of like the directory information. That's the kind of stuff that I'd let them put in there, like equivalent to what you can publish in a directory, like, oh, I can't hear you, or I can't see you, and this kinds of things. I would never really want lengthy conversations. Maybe if they needed my attention, can I speak to you, Stefanie? Something like that. I would think that's appropriate, but not any kind of question about what's happening at the meeting or anything like that, because that's between the client and me, or between Suzanne and her client.
Do you have anything to add, Celia?
I don't want the attorneys to get mad at me, but I'm going to say this, cover your ears. I appreciate the text box as a way to support attendance taking. So when we go around the chat room, and yes, it's not part of the official record, all of that stuff, but it is a saved list of who was at the meeting, and you can take a screenshot of it and embed it directly onto an attendance sheet. And so as a way to supplement those kinds of procedures, as a way to get informal feedback, and if necessary, as a way to give accessibility to someone in the meeting that maybe the volume has gone out or the microphone has gone out or something like that. I think, understanding that chat boxes aren't necessarily, the functional equivalent of a signed document, but to the extent that it can help move a meeting along and help support the meeting, I think it's useful. I do think it's important that everyone remembers once you put something in writing, it's in writing now. And so, I would say use it sparingly, use it for sort of administrative matters, and the substantive things are best left to the conversation. But again, each district has their own practice.
Of course. So the three of you have presented as really collaborative participants in CSE meetings, and I'm wondering whether, in addition to what we discussed, you have any suggestions or any strategies for how you build consensus at a meeting, how you contribute to consensus building? Who would like to go first?
So go ahead.
No, please, it's fine.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, just really making sure that everyone has an opportunity to contribute, and that as a chairperson, where there might not be consensus, really deliberately seeking out those objective points that everyone can agree upon and start from there, right? So finding those things that really are fundamentally, core essential points of agreement, and then building from there. I think it's important to remember that everyone's coming from a place of validity. A parent's feelings are valid, a parent's observations are valid, a teacher's observations are valid, and that it's just really a matter of trying to make sure that everyone is heard. And then that data and, those kinds of things are utilized to supplement all of that, and really try to keep the personalization of the people involved in the process out of it to the extent possible, to make sure that the focus is really on the child's needs.
So important. Thank you. Stefanie?
So what I would add to that is exactly that the main points need to be agreed upon, but I would take it one step further. Sometimes, and I'm finding it a little bit more on the virtual meetings than I am in typical in-person CSE meetings, that there needs to be additional information. And that's why we can't get consensus. There wasn't an evaluation that maybe could be done. There wasn't data that maybe could be collected. And although none of us want to bring back meetings because we were trying to get through it, sometimes it's really important to really understand what the needs of that particular child is, especially in these very uncharted waters where things look so different and can look very different on Zoom than they actually are in the house and they are in person learning. So I think that if there's tremendous roadblocks that data or an additional evaluation could shed some light on, that might be really beneficial to gaining consensus. I'm not saying in every single meeting you have to go back and collect data. That is not my point. But if there's really a question about something that could be answered by data collection or a different evaluation, that might really be helpful.
Thank you. Suzanne, do you have anything to add?
I just have a couple notes jotted down here. I think prioritization is a big deal. Figuring out what is the priorities and what can be done, what time frame it can be done on. I think prioritization and expectations, and realistic expectations, especially when students are if they're doing remote education, right? And my district's being asked to do an FBA or something like that. These practical considerations. How are we going to do it? How are we going to collect the data that Stefanie's asking for? How long is it going to take? And keeping an open mind and keeping some flexibility in terms of the outcomes. And again, to the best of everyone's ability. But yeah, I think prioritization, keeping an open mind, being a little bit flexible, and also, and I'm sure we are all doing this, acknowledging the challenges of being remote, being hybrid, in terms of evaluations, data collection, even pulling meetings together can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge, because of labor issues. And as I mentioned before, end of the school day, things like that.
Thank you.
And I would just add to that, if I may, Julie, that it's very important to, I wouldn't be student advocacy if I didn't say this, and I really do believe that everybody who is coming to these tables realize that the trauma that we've all been through, and that a trauma-informed approach is critical to addressing everybody at the table. The lawyers, the parents, the children, the teachers, the staff. People come to these tables these days with an awful lot, and I think that that's really critical to acknowledge it on everybody's behalf. And we say it to the parents. You don't know what's going on in that school, that person's life in your school, and we also say it to the school districts that, this family's really been through a lot. You don't know what's happened in the last 6 months in this child's life. So I think that's a very important part of these meetings these days.
Thank you. So I do want to make sure we have time for participant questions, but I do think it's important to hear a little bit about what you see as advantages of virtual CSE meetings, as well as some of the pitfalls of virtual CSE meetings. And, how would you remedy them? How would you sort of troubleshoot for technology? So sort of a pros and cons question. Celia?
Sure. I think the biggest pro has been a substantial increase in parent participation. And I can even say that from the parent side, not having to take a whole day off or a half a day off to attend a meeting in person. More spouses are joining, more partners are joining. There are more people at the table because it's a lot easier to get to a virtual meeting sometimes. Not for everybody, so sometimes. And the other benefit of the online meetings is the ability, because it is sometimes a lot easier to get people to the table, is if you need more than 45 minutes or an hour, you can say, you know what, we've gotten this far. Let's reconvene. What's an agreeable time for everyone to come back? So it's a lot easier to come back to the table if need be. So just in terms of scheduling and being able to have all of the participants available, regardless of whether they're working from home or, the city or wherever, that they're, it's really increased participation and sort of by default, the richness of the conversations. The downsides of it are the accessibility. The obvious, what happens when accessibility or access to technology is a real struggle, or, really trying to make sure that documents get to people. So those are things that districts are, working very hard to figure out. And even a year into this, we really had to take what was an in-person, paper-driven operation and completely do a 180 with it and put it online. And so it's not without, the issues trying to be ironed out and, really ensuring that everyone has the technical capacity to participate. So.
And do you see, Celia, do you see CSE meetings continuing virtually in some capacity, even after we're able to return in person?
I think they should. And I think it should remain an option. That's my personal view. What districts do will depend district to district, but I think just the fact that it has increased accessibility and participation, I think it should remain an option. And, frankly, after taking a paper-based operation and putting it online, all of that work, all of those efforts, systems have been completely changed. And so I don't foresee systems going completely back, although I do see, you know, parent and in-person meetings starting again, but I think the option will remain. And I hope that everyone continues to leverage it as an accessibility tool.
Absolutely. Suzanne's pros, cons.
I've got the same pro and I've got the same con as Celia. As a working parent myself, I've never attended the parent partnership call at my son's daycare until COVID, when all of a sudden I didn't have to go and I just could boot it up on my screen. My husband attended. It was exactly what Celia is saying in terms of for those of us who, you know, like everybody has 10 things going on at the same time. It really sort of cuts down your travel time, you know, things like that. And for my districts, you know, not having to carve out travel time, not that I have to travel super far, but, you know, being able to hop on a meeting or, you know, with only a little bit of notice, which is not my favorite thing, but, you know, it can be done and it can be accomplished much more easily. And I think the con is the same in terms of the unfamiliarity with technology can be a problem. And then finally, I would think that if a parent consented to continue to have remote CSE meetings, I would imagine if the parent consented, that it would continue. And I think it would be up to me as the lawyer, you know, I'm not the lawyer, Stefanie is a lawyer too, but as the lawyer from the school district side, you know, I think with parent consent, I don't see much of an issue, but I can imagine why some parents might not want to if they don't have to also.
Right. And in terms of glitches, have you had your clients, have you recommended that they do trial runs with Zoom or other platforms, or circulate cell phones to have backup plans, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Cell phone numbers to be exchanged, or even, you know, direct line numbers so that you don't have to go through, you know, press 2 and press 3 and those sorts of things. I've definitely advised that. I've been in those meetings, or in the beginning of those meetings, we're trying to get people on the phone and trying to do that, and a cell phone number, if the participant is comfortable sharing their cell phone number, is really, you know, a good way. And, you know, I have relationships where we text, and, you know, and that's something that, you know, is uncomfortable. Certain clients are comfortable, again, case by case basis, but nothing like shooting a quick text of an unobtrusive way to just kind of, you know, are you on, or I'm on, where are you, can you see me, things like that. So I would definitely advocate for exchanging cell phone numbers, and even picking up the phone before a meeting and making sure the parent knows what they need to do and what they need to have.
Stefanie, do you have anything to add?
So I would say that it's interesting that the school district thinks it's easier for the parent, which it is, but we have had the pleasure of having so many more teachers attend the meetings, and we feel that's so invaluable to the conversation to really understand the people who are directly working with the children, because they don't have to get a sub and leave a class and wait because the meeting is very long overdue. And I feel the meetings are much more timely. I think they run whatever they need to run. If they need to be adjourned, they get adjourned. And it's really enabled not only parents, but also other professionals from the school district side being able to participate in a meaningful way without too much disruption to their classrooms or their schedules. So that's been I think that's a real positive. Being able to attend 3 CSE meetings in a day is something that I can now do, which I could never do before, because one would be, it would always happen to me if I had a lot. One would be all the ways to the south of the county, and the other one would be all the ways to the north. And I couldn't physically do it. So I'm able to go to many, and so are all the other advocates. So we're able to serve more kids in that way, because we're able to attend more meetings without the travel time involved. but I do miss seeing everybody, and I do miss seeing the children and the parents and the teachers at the table. So that for me is the down.
Thank you. So now I want to turn to some of our participant questions. But before I do, I see that Alyssa has put in the chat, it looks like for everyone. So all participants should be able to see the WIHD planning tools and a link. So that would be in the chat. So our first question is, my daughter is adamant to continue online learning next year. Is it legal to request it from school when everyone else is in-person learning? So I guess I'll put that to the two lawyers. I don't know, Suzanne, if you want to address that.
Well, I think there's some assumptions in this question that I can't really, I don't want to make the assumption in the question that everyone else will have in-person learning next year. I kind of want to, I think it's too early to say whether or not that's what's going to happen in September. I mean, I hope that we all are in person. There are a few different, I'm not sure how, without knowing more about this particular situation, it's hard to say. So again, I don't want to really opine. So for now, I would say, maybe there are, if there's a medical issue, that's one thing.
Right.
And the student wants to stay, and the student in consultation with the doctor needs to stay out of a school building, I think that's one thing, certainly.
So it's going to be individualized.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not, without knowing more, it's hard to answer.
Absolutely. So another participant asks if the CSE chair controls muting and unmuting speakers. I'm thinking this is a district to district question. Or do they leave it to individual participants? Celia, do you want to just speak?
So the host of the meeting can always mute everybody, right? That's just a function that exists. Whoever set up the meeting can always do that. I can speak from my own personal experience that the only time I have, and once you're muted, you can always unmute yourself. Right, so it's not a permanent mute, right? The one time where I muted someone was only because there was a dog or a child crying in the background and the parent clearly needed some support and, with the technical aspects of it, but I wouldn't do it without telling the participants that I was doing it first. So that's the big thing. It's kind of like, okay, we're getting a lot of background noise here, so I'm going to have to mute everyone except for the person who's speaking. And if you need to say something, you can either unmute yourself or raise your hand if you need assistance, the little emoji hand, or put in the chat box. So I think it's just about giving people that heads up if someone needs to be muted, because more of a technical sound issue than anything.
Right, and so the host is always going to be able to mute and unmute. There was also a comment, so I'm just going to share the comment. As a parent, I like when the district pauses after speaking and allows for questions from me before moving on to the next topic. And I think, Celia, you spoke about checking in with parents. Someone asks, what about sharing parent concerns? What is the most appropriate time? At the outset, or in line with providers' reports or present levels of performance, etc.? Stefanie, did you want to answer?
So that would, of course, go to the agenda at the meeting. Some CSE chairs open up the meeting and say, we'd like to hear what the parents' concern, especially if they're the ones who called the meeting, if the parent requested a review. So that's very, very typical. If they're just going, if reports are being read and there's a question, I would encourage a parent to appropriately either raise their hand or make eye contact with the chair so that they would be able to ask the question in real time as they're hearing, maybe they wouldn't be able to scribble down all the questions. I would think before any decisions are made about goals, accommodations, modifications, there should certainly be a question about whether the parent would like to express what their, express some concerns or some positives of what's being said at the meeting. So I think it kind of depends on what kind of meeting it is and at what point the meeting is rolling out. But I would encourage all parents to certainly, this is the time to express the concern. This is when you should do it. Not after the meeting when it's all signed, sealed, and delivered and you get the prior written notice. That's not when you do it. You do it at the meeting.
Thank you. So one last question, and this goes to recording meetings, and we touched on this. And this participant is in the parent-to-parent of New York State Family Advocacy Training, and this issue of recording has come up, and it's been suggested there that parents record meetings. So this parent wants to know how that can be done. If the district is the host, is the meeting something the district can record, or tips for making it happen, 72 hours notice, written consent? What should a parent do to make it happen? If you're the host, you can hit record. Thoughts? Suzanne, do you want to address that?
Well, I don't necessarily want to speak for parents. I can speak for the district requiring adequate notice. If we're not on Zoom, usually we just go grab our little recorder, right? So, but I think with Zoom, but we do really like to have that advanced notice if the parent's going to record. So maybe Stefanie or Celia could weigh in.
Stefanie, do you have suggestions for recording?
Sure. If you're going to record, I would certainly give notice to the district, and I would have a conversation with the district about how can I want to record? Are you going to record? How should we best accomplish this? And I would try to work it out. It would go to the collaboration to work with the district to accomplish a common goal for a good meeting. That's how I would rely, and I wouldn't do it without the district knowing. And everybody's got a cell phone, and people are recording stuff all the time. So it's not hard to. The technology is there, but I still think the collaboration and in the execution, it should be appropriate. And if a parent really needs to or feels they want to, as long as the district is aware of it and can make their own recording, there's no reason they shouldn't be able to record it.
Excellent. So we've hit the magic time of 8 o'clock, right on schedule. And a big thank you to Suzanne, Stefanie, and Celia. You are all terrific, and your perspectives are all so important. We are so grateful, the Lower Hudson Special Education Task Force, for your willingness to come share all your insights and expertise. So thank you so much. And thank you to all the participants that were with us tonight. We welcome you in future programs, and we really encourage all stakeholders to come together in forums like this to help support students with disabilities. Thank you all.